Welcome to the podcast, Sean McCusker. Great to have you on. I came across you on LinkedIn, looked at briefly what your research was talking about, and thought that having a conversation about the connections between clowning and education would be a fantastic episode. And I know we've had a couple of off-air conversations, and it's going to be a fantastic episode because I know what we're going to be talking about. I know things that we've already breached. But it's kind of important for listeners just to know a little bit about who you are and where you come from. And I know, and this is where I think is the really interesting juxtaposition. You have a PhD in engineering.
I do, in fluid mechanics. So I spent many years locked in a room with a wind tunnel, not speaking to anyone.
So having, and you work in a university, and you are effectively an academic, aren't you? And somebody involved in education.
Associate professor at Northumbria.
Yes, but you have a connection or an interest in clowning. So where did that come from? Where did that stem from?
Well, it's a good few years back when I first moved out of engineering and a little bit of teaching, and I moved into education over at Durham. And I worked with a guy called Jim Ridgway, who unfortunately died last year. But we had a really good working relationship where we were able to say anything we wanted to the other person, and we knew no offense would be taken. And there was a little bit of sort of, mischief about it as well. But it meant that we could ask the kind of questions or say the kind of things which no one else really ever said. And it kind of realized that, through saying things that you don't normally say, you get to talk about things you don't normally talk about and think about things that you don't normally think about. So it really worked very well for questioning norms and accepted wisdom and those kinds of things. I didn't realize at the time, but it was just the way we worked, and it was quite funny, really. But later on, I kind of realized that was very effective and overlapped with that idea of the court jester and speaking truth to power and challenging norms and those kind of things. That's kind of where it started off, really. And so it just kind of bubbled away in the background for a long time. And I read bits and pieces about it whenever I could. And then one day decided to do it seriously.
But you do have some of those skills as well, don't you? You have effectively clowning skills, however you would label that. You have had.
Spent a dangerously long time learning to juggle and unicycle. I say dangerously long because it nearly resulted in my failure of my second year.
Did those two things ever come together, the unicycling and the juggling?
Yeah, one brief moment at my peak of both. There's a photograph of me juggling whilst on a unicycle, but that was for a brief 5 minutes, after which I never managed to do it again.
So the question really is there, initially what kind of drew you into clowning? You've kind of touched on that with your colleague there, and everybody needs a friend like that at work, don't they?
Well, it's just that way of questioning norms and being a little bit cheeky with it, or to push a limit and then sit there and watch what happened, kind of thing. So it meant that we could do it with each other. We were very familiar doing it with each other, but we could do it in polite company as well, a little bit, knowing that the other person knew what you were up to. So you had a bit of support there whilst you played with people, really.
So there was this kind of meeting at some point, then, wasn't it? Your academic world and your experience as a young man in clowning came together, and I know that this conversation about clowning and education goes a lot deeper than I ever actually thought it would. And I had some ideas and thoughts in my head, and then we're having chats. I'm thinking, blimey, this is actually quite revelationary stuff when you really put it in context. I've seen circus clowns when I was younger. I've seen rodeo clowns at the Calgary Stampede. I've watched Disney and seen Dumbo, but it's there's more to it than that, isn't it? If you ask that question, what is a clown? I know we saw that was the kind of the opening question. What is a clown? Is a lot deeper than I ever thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I first started looking at it, I had also seen it quite superficially, in terms of the performance of a clown, or even that bit of, I'd say, of asking questions which you wouldn't normally ask, and that's where I started. But the more I read about it, the more I saw resonances across all sorts of aspects of teaching. But the question of what is a clown, for me, and it's not as if it's my idea, it's what I've gathered from my reading and my working with clowns, is that the clown's what's left when you strip away everything else, it's that sort of quintessential raw humanity of who you are once you stop pretending to be anyone else, once you stop putting on the show which you need to put on to be a father, to be a teacher, to be a husband, to be a partner, to all those things which you have to pretend about. Well, not pretend, but those roles you play when there are other people around. So the clown's almost the you who's left when you're singing in the shower, and there's no one else to.
And it's interesting, isn't it? If you put that in context of education, talking about the role of the father, role of the teacher, whatever that happens to be, these are all, you don't realise it as much as you step back and think about it. These are roles we take on, and we do put on a bit of a mask.
That's
a little
right.
bit in those roles, isn't it? Each of those roles you take on has a different energy, a different persona, a different language, all of those things. And your analogy there to, it's you when you're singing in the shower is kind of great. Who are we? And I know we talked about the idea of authenticity over the past couple of days.
Yeah.
That fits
When
in
you
with that, doesn't it? And we'll touch on that, I'm assuming, later on. But it's that idea of who are you? The
yeah.
clown is who you are.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, I must say that a lot of this was through. I did a bit of clown training with a woman called Andrea Jimenez, who really put across many of these ideas of who's left, of that. Well, what she talks about really is the clown, the red nose, being the smallest mask, but it's different from every other mask in that all the other masks tend to cover up, whereas the red nose is the one mask that reveals. And so that it reveals who you are once you put that on.
What do you mean by that? I think I know what you mean, but that you're popping on that little mask. It's not covering all of you. It's not a full-on costume. It's this tiny little. It's a little gesture.
It's a gesture, which means that when you put on that red nose, you drop every other mask. You drop every other pretense or barrier or shield that you have, and you open yourself up and say, "This is who's left."
So I guess it's almost like a key to being brave enough to be yourself, then, isn't it?
That's right. That's right.
But are there expectations on clowns that putting on that mask will create a certain type of image or a certain type of behaviour, or an expectation on, I am a clown, this is what I do?
Yeah, there is. I mean, some of those come from yourself. Early on, when I was looking at this, I got a number of red noses, and it's all very well putting on a red nose in company that you know. So you might go into a class or amongst friends and say, "Oh, look, I can put on a red nose. I don't mind." But I kind of challenged myself to go into a public space in the Metro Centre, one of these huge shopping centres up in the northeast here, and just on my own in public, just to put on the red nose for a minute. And that was really hard, because you think, as soon as I put this on, people will expect something of me. But also enduring that awkwardness of putting on that nose and living in that difficult space was very much what a clown might have to do. So, I forced myself to do it. And when people show an interest in what I'm doing, I challenge them to do that, and not to do it with a friend or with anyone around. You have to do it on your own and very public. And I think it's pretty hard.
And terrifying by the sounds of it. And was there an expectation, if you do that people looking are going to eyes on and they're going to go, oh, here's something funny. Yeah. Something funny is going to happen. This is a funny guy or gal who's going to put on a little show for me. And then the nose signifies so much, doesn't it, in that way?
Yeah. So you don't deliver on that.
Well, it's an expectation to deliver. And I wonder, if you want to tie that back to teaching, there's an expectation to deliver in teaching, isn't there? That you are the one stood up front and eyes are on you, and there's an expectation on how you're going to perform and what you're going to do. So there is a kind of a correlation there, isn't it?
You're in a role, aren't you? When you put on that nose, people have that expectation of the role. I think people have. Well, most people have quite a narrow view of what a clown is, very much based on the sort of circus clown.
Completely. I mean, in our couple of previous conversations, you have nudged my perspective and thoughts on that in terms of what my understanding was, and the evolution of a clown, the court jester, the fool, the Jungian archetype.
Yeah.
Is it worth touching on that? Because it does go deeper, doesn't it? The symbolism of clown is so much deeper than let's put on a red nose and some big shoes and make a big
Yeah, I
show
mean
with the custard pie.
that's one form of clown, and that's the form of clown which which we have in the West, or in the UK at least, and that's pretty much defined by one or two well-known clowns. I think Grimaldi perhaps was one of those who set the archetype for the clown. But when I talk about the clown, I talk in very wide, general terms. I mean, I include the clown and the jester and the fool and the bouffon and all these different kinds of clowns, and I know within sort of the global north, or Western culture, we have ideas about the differences between these kind of clowns. The sort of Shakespearean scholars will know that there was a change between the clown in Shakespeare and the fool in Shakespeare. But actually, when you look globally, there are clown characters in all kinds of societies. In Asian society, in African society, in Native American societies, such that the difference between a clown, a jester, and a fool is quite small compared to the differences between those types and clowns internationally. And so I bundle them all as one, really, and I include all those clown societies.
But the fact they exist throughout these
Yeah.
cultures as an archetype means that there is a role and a purpose, and it's something deep in the human psyche has created this need for a clown or a fool or a buffoon or a jester.
Yeah, that's something outside, slightly outside of society, or outside of the norms, to balance against. And I think that's one of the roles of the clowns is across many societies, the clowns are always on the margins of those societies. Across almost all societies, the role of the clown is for the benefit of society. So in West African cultures, you have these corredugas who appear at initiation ceremonies as adolescents become men. They appear at the celebration, masked, covered up, and act as adolescents, so that society recognizes what they would look like if children never grew up. If you imagine a world where people were perpetual teenagers, it's horrifying. And so they demonstrate what that would be like. And so through that demonstration of what life might be like if you didn't follow societal norms, you demonstrate why those norms are important. And so because they live these alternative lives, I mean, the ones I really was fascinated by were the contraries who existed amongst the Native Americans on the plains, so the Lakota and the Dakota. They had these contraries or Heyoka, they were also known as, who would do everything in reverse. So when it came to a battle, they would ride in backwards on their horses, or when everyone else was retreating from the battle, they would go in and attack. And so, obviously it buys space for everyone else, a great sacrifice to themselves, on top of which they would wear the worst clothes and they would never wash and live in the worst kind of conditions. So these are people you wouldn't really want living in your settlement. So they always ended up living on the margins of society. And that's really quite an important role of demonstrating what happens outside of that, outside of those norms, outside of your society. There's where you could end up.
I mean, how on earth do we tie that into education and learning and teaching, though? I think the idea of the rite of passage we talked about, didn't we, a little bit, I think?
Yeah. I mean, so the way I see that is that living in those margins is a really difficult space. And I tie this back to the idea of rites of passage because Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner, anthropologists, who looked at a number of tribal societies, but also made reference to more modern societies and the spaces between states in which we find ourselves. So you might be an adolescent who's a child but not yet an adult, and you had to go through these rites of passage. It might be going off into the wilderness on your own for a week or two. So you leave as a child, but you come back as an adult if you come back. But in that in between stage, you're neither a child nor an adult. Or if you look at someone who's finished their their exams but hasn't graduated. They're in these liminal spaces between states. And that's what that kind of ties in with Ray Land and Jan Mayer's work on threshold concepts. The idea that there are certain forms of what they call troublesome knowledge, in which you have a certain understanding of the world, and taking on new knowledge which strongly contradicts what you already understand is difficult. But once you've taken on that knowledge, you see the world in a different way. So I talked about this in terms of, it might be the square root of -1, which we're told, you can't have square roots of negative numbers. But there's a whole field of mathematics based on what they call imaginary numbers. And once you understand that you can have these imaginary numbers, it allows you to do all kinds of mathematics. But grasping that idea of the square root of -1 is really quite difficult. And you move between these states of, really knowing there's no such thing as the square root of -1, to thinking that solves lots of issues, and then changing your mind again. So you're moving in between what they call this liminal space. So if you think of the threshold between the outside and the inside, or between rooms, there's a physical space between the two which you can move within, either near one side or the other. And it's a space of being lost. The other example I use is postmodernism. So, we start off with the idea that the world is what we see around us, and it's not up for question, really. And when you start learning about postmodernism, you sort of think, well, hang on a second, what do you mean this isn't a reality? And for a while you think, oh well, that's easy, just none of this is real. And then you go, oh no, hang on a second, that actually doesn't make sense. So you go back to that sort of real view of the world, and slowly you make your way back, thinking, oh, I think I understand it better now. And you make your way back towards this postmodernist thinking, and you think, oh yeah, now I get it. That explains everything. And then you go back again. So you stay within these spaces, and sometimes you don't come out of those spaces. I think in mathematics, people reach a level where they go, I can't find my way through this. I know the stuff that I understood is wrong, but I don't quite understand this new stuff. And I'm kind of there, I suppose, with postmodernism, is that I know there's a view where the world we see around us isn't real, but I don't quite get what they're on about, and I'm not sure I'm going to come out the other side and ever understand what they're on about.
I feel I sit in that camp with you in that. I mean, they were two beautifully eloquently explained examples. I mean, the couple I'm going to throw back at you now are not as anywhere near on that level. But when you were talking there, I was thinking about, you mentioned that when young people pass their exams but they haven't yet moved on to the next phase, and you're in that sort of empty space. There's almost something, I remember something having sat my GCSEs but not having yet got my results. There's also something quite joyous in that sense of, there's nothing I can do about this right now. So my life is in limbo. It's almost like you're floating in this area of nothingness because you can't move on and you can't go back. And it's actually quite nice in some respects.
Well, Victor Turner calls this a moment of pure potentiality.
Yeah, I like that.
Oh, yeah, it's really exciting, isn't it? Yeah. And for the clown lives in that moment. So what happens afterwards doesn't really matter. And there's a guy called Bertil Sylvander who was talking about the clown existing in the now of the moment, and that's the only moment they inhabit. What happens next doesn't really matter. Okay, so where this ties into education is that we're always asking people to learn new stuff, and often learning new stuff means leaving behind what you already know. So you drop what you know because that doesn't work. You don't just stick a 0 at the end of the number when you multiply by 10, but what is going on? So until you take on the new stuff, nothing makes any sense, and you're in this real wilderness. And we ask learners to do that all the time. And there are, as I say, there's a work of Ray Land and Jan Mayer looks exactly at those kind of concepts. And what I'm saying is that because the clown lives in that space, the clown teacher is familiar with that space, and they can't help the learner through it because they mustn't. It's a rite of passage. It's a process they need to endure to be able to come out the other side. So they can't help them through it because that's not how it works, but they can accompany them. And you see that sometimes, when you're teaching or if you have children, they're going through difficult times, and you can't take that strain off them no matter how much you want to, because it's something that they must do themselves if they are to mature, if they're to grow up, if they're to learn. But you can accompany them.
And I think as well as teachers, we're always expecting young people to think about the future. We're working towards this all the time. Yeah. And our role, and whether I agree or disagree, that our role seems to be to give them what they need to get to that place. And what you're saying really is you're running parallel to them. And I know we spoke briefly about the school run by Mackenzie Price over in America, where having done the 2 hours of solid learning, they're then accompanying their young people through their own choices of activity, their own journeys, their own interests. And actually maybe looking at the role of the teacher, what we can learn from the clown is that we should be there to accompany as much as to...
Yeah. We see this in Leo, where the fool accompanies Leo literally into the storm. Yeah, he's by his side. He's not sheltering him or anything, but he stays by him. Yeah? And that's what I'm suggesting as a teacher. I mean, I should state here, I'm at no stage suggesting that teachers walk into a class with a red nose and a wig and big shoes. It's that idea of embodying the clown spirit. We look at what it is that clowns do well, what it is about the practices and philosophies, and the loose use of the word philosophy, of clowns, which teachers can use in their practice.
And as teachers as well, with the idea of threshold concepts, I've been teaching 25 years now, and things change a lot in terms of knowledge of how young people learn. We have better knowledge of things like dyslexia, neurodivergency, and we have training. And all the time, what you thought you knew is changing, particularly about how the brain works and how we learn and how young people access education, how they access information. And we do end up quite often in those threshold concept spaces, if you like, where our old knowledge has to be tweaked at best, dropped at worst, then we have to move on to something completely new. And the expectation is we can absorb that. So we're often going through that phase ourselves, aren't we, as educators? And we should be. The should be is the point, I think.
I think they're good examples you give, the ideas of dyslexia or many forms of neurodiversity, where you think you know a bit about it. And so you think it explains a lot about the learner in front of you. Then you realize actually it doesn't. As you learn more, you learn actually that's not so simple as that. So you go back a little bit and said it doesn't explain everything. So you go back a bit and almost have it that it explains nothing. Then you slowly move forward again. Then you go back again and you move forwards and backwards in this wilderness where it explains something. That the model you had before doesn't work, but you don't know what model does work. Yes, exactly those spaces. And that idea of being lost, of not knowing what comes next, is really important. Andrea Jimenez, as I mentioned before, she says, when the clown knows what's happening next, the clown is dead. So it's living in that now.
The amount of time I spent trying to think about the young people that I'm teaching and who they are and where they need to be, and you're juggling, and that's it being in the moment with them, isn't it? You're getting to learn, you're on that journey with them, you're in the wilderness with them, is the kind of thing, isn't it? Terribly hard to do as a teacher, terribly hard, because at the end of the day, sometimes you've got 30 kids in front of you and you are a teacher expected to get them through these exams. But what we're saying, isn't it, really, is we're not saying that all teachers, as you said, should go in with the red nose and the shoes and be a clown. We should be taking some lessons from clowns into our own classrooms. Yeah,
you can't fix things for them, but you can be there whilst they fix them themselves.
It's a nice concept. I mean, moving forward then, so part of this podcast was hopefully going to be talking about some of the skills that clowns have, or some of the things that by being a clown or learning a little about clowning, we can bring into our own personalities, our own teaching. And we have spoken about it briefly, but sort of improvisation as a starting point, I know was also part of your thesis.
Oh, it was a book.
Yeah, book, yeah.
Yeah, so Sorry, I always get thesis confused with the actual thesis, which is the digital image processing approach to large-scale turbulent flows, which doesn't.
which demonstrates, doesn't it? Your sort of day job could not be further away from, in some respects, the clowning that we're talking about now, on paper at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the two arguments I make, one of them is about that accompaniment through that space, that wilderness, that through that liminal space. But the other one is really about what teachers have to learn from clowns in terms of improvisation. And improvisation, I don't mean improvisation as a dismissal of expertise or knowledge in that kind of way. Improvisation really requires a lot more expertise, because I'm talking about improvisation in the sense of not making it up as you go along, but calling on a rich repertoire of routines of expertise. And the example I give is of the Commedia dell'arte, the Italian theatre, where there's a cast of characters, and they have very strict characters, very strict roles, Franceschina, Arlecchino, and these whose personalities to some degree are set. And they know where they start and they know where they need to end up. But how they get there is improvised throughout the play. But of course, these are who've played that role many, many times, and often come from families who've played that role through generations. So they're not making it up on the spot. What they're doing is they're calling on a number of mini routines, which they patch together. So it's kind of watching where the audience is going and adjusting and adjusting and adjusting. And as teachers, we can do this. We're not making it up. Maybe it's like jazz improvisation, but hopefully more tolerable. And that idea that you've got a number of mini teaching episodes which you can patch together, and the next one depends very much on what happened on this one. But this is really all about feedback. So Stacey Sachs, who wrote the Clown Manifesto with Nale Lanila, talks about a constant pulsation between the audience and the performer. And that was a really, really nice way of putting it. And I was thinking that's kind of what we need as teachers. That when we talk about feedback, it's reduced to writing comments in an essay, and that's not feedback. Feedback is that live interaction. It's got to be two ways. What you take from the students, you change your behavior and feed it back. And Dylan William, who is a leader on the idea of formative assessment and feedback, draws the analogy of an airplane leaving an airport. It knows where it's starting from and it knows where it's got to go. But if it sets one fixed course, it won't arrive there because it needs to adjust based on wind and other sorts of conditions, and just constantly adjust and adjust and adjust. And I think I see that within the Commedia dell'arte, but also as something we need to do within teaching. And that improvisation is really important, because otherwise you can get very, very stale staying in safe areas. So when I used to juggle, I could do certain tricks at home which I'd get right 50% of the time. But if I juggled in public, which wasn't that often, but if I juggled in public, I made sure I stayed on the safe tricks. I didn't want to fail so publicly. It's that fear of failure. And so what I suggest really is that when you start improvising, do improvise right at the edge so that you do fail. And it's okay to fail. We tell our students, our learners all the time, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail. It's okay to be wrong. And we tell them that the whole time. And, to some degree, when they are wrong or when they do fail, we're accepting of it. Where we don't accept failure or being wrong is in ourselves. So when our students see how we respond to being wrong or to failing, and the way we try and cover it up and pretend we meant something else, and all those kind of things that some teachers do, clearly not you or I, those things which some teachers do, that's what the learner sees. That's what the learner sees as what's happening when you make a mistake. And so they don't learn from that they should make mistakes, or that it's okay to make mistakes. And they learn that actually that the teacher tries to cover them up.
And also, I think how you react,
how you react,
how
they
you
don't.
react to that, how you react to that is really important, isn't it? Because I know that for a lot of young people, they find great humor, and it's not malicious humor. It's just humor in the fact that you're doing something and it's gone wrong. And actually, it's part of building relationships and trust and all sorts of things. Oh, he can do that as well. He's a human being.
Yeah, but it's that humor. That humor is, I think, he's saying, is the clown supposed to be funny? The clown's supposed to be authentic. And when you're authentic, that's where that humor, that's where the laugh comes from. It comes from seeing the raw, authentic you. And that's funny, because the authentic you of everyone, of what Andrea calls the pure stupid self. And this isn't stupid in the conventional sense of the word stupid, but stupid in the sense of that childlike naivety, when a 5-year-old makes a mistake, oh, stupid child. You don't. It's funny because it's naive. Yeah. And if we allow that in ourselves, this is where it goes, you see, because if we allow ourselves to make mistakes, in the first place, the students learn that they can make mistakes, that it's okay to make mistakes. But what they do is they see themselves in you. They recognize themselves in you. And we talk about, the Donald Sean stuff about reflection on practice and reflection in practice. But that's an introspective reflection. It's reflection here in close. What I'm talking about here with the clowns is the reflection of, not reflection upon, it's a reflection of. So you reflect your audience. And when their audience see themselves in you, they empathize. So when a circus clown tries something outrageously difficult, yeah, and you think, oh my God, you don't want them to fail. You want them to succeed. And when they fail, you go, oh yeah, that's just the way it goes, because that's what happens to me. And so you build an empathy with them, because they're making all the mistakes that you make, and they're facing all the obstacles that you face, and they're failing like you fail. And so you build that empathy, and through that empathy, you build a connection. Yeah?
And I think as well, going back to the idea of authenticity that you were talking about there, I think that's probably one of the most important lessons a new or young teacher can learn, really, is that if you go in trying to be something that you're not, they will see straight through you, and you need to be yourself. And I know in my school, I'm a certain type of teacher, but there are very quiet, calm teachers who equally can engage their classes. There are quite feisty and fiery teachers. I will be the one tap dancing on the table to teach beats in music. I will be the one roller skating in the corridor to teach about friction and forces. But you need that, don't you? You need that in a school. The pupils don't want to come in and know they're going into a place and they're just going to have all these same people. Yeah. Teaching can be a great reflection of human diversity if teachers just be themselves.
It isn't it? It's that authenticity of finding out who you are as a teacher. And I don't think that's easy. Nale Lanila, he's a big 6'2" or more, big Swedish guy. And he talks about learning his clowning from a small Italian woman. And then he goes on to say that in the first few years of being a clown, he was trying to be a small Italian woman, and not until he realized that he wasn't, and became his own clown, did he really flourish. And I think there are two sides to that. As a teacher, you've got to find out what kind of teacher you are. But until you do, it's okay to try and emulate someone else, because, if people say be yourself. But if you don't know who you are, then until you find out, then be someone else.
And I think there's a lot of external pressures on teachers, aren't there, to almost be a certain type of teacher because of the expectations on outcomes, the expectations on what a good observation is, the expectations on behaviour. And some expectations for some teachers might be absolutely silent pupils all looking the same direction. But I personally I don't care if a pupil sits cross-legged on a chair. I don't care if they find it more comfortable to stand up and talk and listen, because that's them and I'm me, and it's okay. Outside of disruptive behaviour, that's not being disruptive, that's just being comfortable. And I think we need to look at that expectation on who we are as pupils and as teachers.
Yeah.
And that idea of authenticity ties into that beautifully.
Yeah. It's that idea of finding out who you are or how you respond to things as a teacher. Because, if you're emulating a teacher who would make jokes or so on, and you're not that kind of person,
Mm.
and it sounds really flat. And yourself, when you watch a performance which isn't authentic, you can see straight through it. When you see a stand-up, and some stand-ups are just telling jokes, and some stand-up are telling stories from within, and you can let.
I think it's the same as well. If you think back to your own school days, who are the teachers that stand out for you? And the ones that stand out are the personalities and the characters because they were being themselves. And they were likable for a whole diverse range of reasons. Some of them were lovely, calm, just nice people. Some of them are slightly chaotic. Some of them were a bit mean, but they still sort of stand out because there was just something about them that was authentic.
They were funny because of how mean they were.
Yeah, and there's almost, for some of them, there almost wasn't a meanness in their meanness, if that makes sense. They were a nice person, but they used to do things. Oh, that's So I think authenticity, absolutely. I mean, we've sort of touched on the question, but it is worth coming back to this idea: are clowns meant to be funny, or is there a role of humour in clowning? Because I think back to some of the teachers I had when I was younger, some of the more memorable ones were funny, not necessarily because they told jokes or they just had a humorous personality or the way that they delivered or they were engaging in a kind of entertaining way. And I know clowning is not just the funny guy, but where does humour sit in clowning?
I mean, I think when I first introduced the subject of clowning within teaching, often I don't get long to talk about it, so this is fantastic. But you've got 15 minutes where you've got to overcome so much. You've got to cover so much ground early on about what it is to be a clown and these kind of things. But when you introduce the idea, a lot of people go immediately to a teacher they know who was funny. So clown is seen as someone funny who tells jokes, or they see that it's what the teacher can learn about performance from a clown. And yeah, you can. But there's lots of people you can learn about being funny from. There's lots of people you can learn about performance from. And so they're okay, but they're kind of the trivial side of it. All those other aspects we've talked about the authenticity, about existing in the wilderness and so on are the more important parts. But is a clown supposed to be funny? No, they're supposed to be authentic. And the authentic is funny. The authentic is where all those important parts of connection come from. So I've referred before to this clown manifesto, Nale Lanila, and in the reading of it, he has a list of 10 commandments. So of course there are 11 of them, but the three which really, really stick in my mind: the role of the clown isn't to be stupid, but not to be afraid of appearing stupid. So this plays into a lot of things we talked about in terms of, making mistakes, of existing in that awkwardness. The role of the clown is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. For me, that blows me away. It really does. It's
I know when you sent that through to me, I was, oh, that's good. That's a good
I
thing
don't know
to
where
have
it
on.
originates, but yeah, it's really where you want to be as a teacher.
Mm.
And it takes away from that idea of a meanness or a reason to be afraid of a clown. Because if you're not in a strong position, the clown's not going to come for you. Right? And the third one is that there are only two things a clown must do. That's connect and play. So, okay, I'll accept that the teacher doesn't need to play, but to connect. And those three things were about the clown or the performer, but they're there so much more, beyond performance for the teacher. So no, you're not supposed to be funny, but you're supposed to do those three things, and that is kind of the authenticity.
But you mentioned connectedness there. And sometimes humour is a way to connect, isn't it? I know when you go and see a performance of a clown, the humour is a hook to be in the audience with them, to engage with the audience, to pull the audience in, because people do like humor, don't they? But it doesn't have to be that, because I mean, it can be, when you're watching things, it can be just the amazingness of what they're doing. I remember being in Canada, I believe, and seeing a street performer juggling on a unicycle, but the unicycle is one of those incredibly sort of 15-foot high, where they get 3 audience members to hold it just to get up there kind of things. And yes, it was entertaining and amusing, but the hook for me was the engagement was, blimey, what's he doing? And I kind of guess for teachers sometimes as well, when I do, and you know, working in a SEND environment, science is not overly deep when I do that, but sometimes the activity that I'm putting on is that trying to get that connectedness. I'm trying to do it in an engaging way. I know when I make a cloud in a bottle, for example, with a bike pump and a bit of surgical spirit and pop the cap and all the rest of it, I do that in a very dramatic sort of on top of the table, putting on ear defenders and safety equipment. I don't need any of it. It becomes a show just to get the kids to look. And I guess there's something funny about that. So that's not kind of humorous. It's not me deliberately using humor to be funny, is it? It's using humor to engage.
To connect. And I think that's right, because that's who you are. You're a funny guy, right?
But I nodded at that too quickly, didn't I? I'm a funny guy.
Looks aren't everything. But if you had a trainee come through and they were much more straight-laced, you ask them to do all that stuff, because it would really fall flat, you know. I also use the method called Lego serious play, and I try and get the playfulness into it. So I start off with a little bit of gentle ribbing and, you know, and tease people about their models they've built and so on, but very, very gently, and it's to get people laughing and feeling playful. But I've seen other people try it, and it just looks rude, because there's something just off about the delivery, because it's not them. It's someone trying to emulate the lines I used without the spirit. If that's not you, then that's not authentic, and you won't connect.
And there's the idea, isn't it, of almost like clown spirit, but I guess there's like teacher spirit as well. And just going briefly back to the idea of play and playfulness, it's not all about play, but actually being playful in the classroom sometimes is quite engaging, you know, and following almost like a crow in the wind. You're just following the flow of the, you know, so somebody brings something up and it's, oh, let's just look at that. And we just kind of go with it for a little bit. And that sort of disconnection from the plan, which kind of goes back to what we were talking back with improvisation at the start, isn't it?
Having this further, it goes back into that idea of being playful with ideas. What would happen if? Could we try this? Right, and you throw an idea out and you talk it through. You think, okay, that won't work, or actually that won't work because of these underlying sort of assumptions or the nature of society, you know. And so you can play with the idea. You know, we talk about play, and there's almost, well, I'd say there's a difference between play and playfulness. Too often within education, we have these educational games or ideas of things which are called play, which aren't actually that much fun, and you would never choose to do them in your spare time. So that's not really play. Yeah, you choose to do them over a maths worksheet, but often with them there's so little learning left because you've tried to squeeze in some play.
I guess the next thing to talk about a little bit is, and this for me really was when I was doing my little bit of research on clowns, and it's a tenuous link in terms of what I know you're going to say about this, I feel. But I was sort of, and the idea that the clowns used to have sort of an egg with the face painted on, everyone had their own identity that they kept, and it was you almost copyrighted it, and it was just a little moment. I was just reading, and it was just passing through, but it touched on the idea of the clown having a persona. You know, and the importance of persona, which I guess we've kind of touched on really when we're talking about that need for authenticity.
So we talked about this with the idea of the big Swedish guy trying to be a small Italian woman, and it's down to that authenticity of who you are within that, within your role as a clown or within your role as a teacher. The persona is the authentic you, and that varies across teachers or across.
And maybe going right back to what we said right at the start about people's misconceptions about clowns and what clowns look like and that stereotype. And I know we've talked briefly in our pre-conversations about the negative generic persona of some clowns, that people have the idea of the Stephen King It clown or the horror movie clown, or we're now so far away from that, actually, that sort of stereotype from this conversation sort of no longer exists in my head. But are there things about that persona, that stereotypical persona, that we as teachers can take on board?
So whenever I talk about clowns in education, people sort of say, I am me. I hate clowns, and clowns have had a really bad press. You know, we've got Stephen King type clown, and we've got, you know, the birthday clown, or the clown that turns up at kids' birthday parties are really quite scary. And then you had those, I think it was in the 2010s, and started in Northampton of all places, these what they call the killer clowns, who hang around. And this fascinated me because it described them as people who were dressing up as clowns. And this was before I was really looking at it, but it always tickled me that they were dressing up as clowns. So how did that differ from clown? But subsequently, I think I've got what it is that, we talk, there was Boris Johnson was always portrayed as a clown, Donald Trump portrayed as a clown. But for me, as we talked about earlier, the clown is always there to serve society. He's always there for the benefit of society, often at great cost to themselves, because they're then pushed to the margins of that same society. They're not fully accepted. But that's where the clown lives. It's in those margins, the margin or the liminal spaces. But these people who are portrayed as bad clowns, the other one was a John Wayne Gacy, who was a serial killer who dressed up as a clown. These guys aren't working for the good of society. So almost by definition, they aren't clowns. They are pretending to be clowns, or we portray them as clowns, but we're really doing clowns a disservice in portraying Boris Johnson as a clown, because clowns are better than that.
But in that, and in the moment that he was on the zip line waving the Union Jack, and it wasn't, people found that funny, I guess, because it was more about him being the buffoon rather than the clown in that moment. He wasn't doing anything. It wasn't a conscious choice to be funny. It just happened. And we use that word clown, don't we, in a wrong way, I guess is what we're saying.
That. He did that very well. He really owned that.
No, I can't say he didn't own it. No, absolutely.
You've got a picture of, I think it's Ed Miliband sort of eating a burger, and he looks ridiculous. But that's kind of more of a humiliating image for him, whereas Boris Johnson stuck on a wire with his legs up, waving a flag, was celebratory, So when people called him a clown, he kind of pushed that idea away. He could have quite easily adopted it and run with it, really. It would have been quite successful.
And in a way, what he was doing was what we have talked about earlier on. He was embracing the moment. He was living between those spaces because he was neither here nor there. But I guess, it is, and it's not necessarily linked to teaching and learning, but it's really important to talk about the idea that I think like you say, the media and films and things have done clowns a disservice, in the same way that Jaws did a disservice to great white sharks. And hopefully in the same way that people are now learning that great white sharks have an important place in the ecosystem of the ocean, clowns have an important place. I think this conversation has been really valuable in terms of kind of pushing that. But if we take some aspects of that stereotype, if you like, in the circus, the concept of like using objects and using props to engage and as part of a routine, as part of a performance, what can teachers get from that? We think of the red nose, think of the oversized shoes, we think of the big baggy trousers and the braces. We've decided, and we've talked about the fact that's not what we're talking about here, but in terms of performing, using things to perform.
I don't think the props really come into it. I think, the improvisation perhaps might come from using what's around you. And in terms of the performance, if we look at the circus clown, every other act in the circus performs for the audience. They're in their ring, and the audience sits around and watches them. The clown is the only act which performs with the audience. So they're in amongst the audience, at times performing in the audience. And that's really important for a teacher. It's this Freirean idea of the teacher-learner, where, especially, given the sort of prevalence of technology and AI and so on, the teacher's not at the front with all the knowledge anymore. And the teacher needs to position themselves as a learner as well, so that they're not always at the front. And in Shakespeare, you have the fools who step out of the play for a little bit to narrate to the audience and then step back into the play. It's that removing yourself from that role and placing yourself amongst your audience once in a while.
Which is what a lot of the sort of conversational chatter about teaching has become, hasn't it? About not being that didactic. It's been going on for years now, hasn't it? At the front, just trying to impart knowledge onto young people who then have to write it down and pass an exam. It's become so much more complex than that. It's exploratory. It's about them being involved in their learning and you being a mentor and a sort of a facilitator.
But it's really hard.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I think this is how we learn from clowns, is that a lot of things that we ask teachers to do that we know are pedagogically useful, being amongst your students, allow yourselves to be wrong, all these things that we know are really useful, but they're really hard to do as a teacher. They're really hard to let go, to give up control and allow that to happen as a teacher. But it's just basic for a clown. So what I'm advocating really is not putting on the red nose, is learning these techniques as a clown and practicing them as a teacher. So they're easy enough to learn as a clown. And, it's as simple as, I ran some clowning workshops and I've taken part in some clowning workshops. I say I ran them. It was Andrea Jimenez who ran them. Part of what we did was to allow the participants to appear stupid. So you're kind of exposed and feeling a bit daft and awkward and lost and all those things. Because honestly, doing the clown training, really, really hard, really uncomfortable all the time, all right? But just on the edge of saying, nah, I'm done with this, I'm going home. But Andrea kept you right at that edge. People who were drama students were kept at their edge. I was kept at my edge. And so what happened is that in these workshops, you do feel exposed and stupid, but it's okay because everyone else has to endure that. But it then means, if you do that on the Friday afternoon, you come to my workshop, and then on Tuesday, you're in a meeting, and you think, oh, I could say this, but I might appear a bit stupid. But you know what? Last Friday, I appeared far more stupid than this. So what? So used to being stupid, so used to feeling awkward. A lovely one I do with students, particularly master's students who are a bit older and this kind of thing, is I think it's Ruth Butler came up with this 8-second rule where when teachers ask a question, the time between asking the question and following up is usually between half a second and 1 second. But if you ask a question and then count off 8 seconds in your head, just absolutely silent, really awkward, and you can see the students feeling awkward, and before the 8 seconds are up, someone will say something. But it's living in that awkwardness, and the clown training allows you to exist in that space. Not saying it stops you from feeling awkward or uncomfortable, but it stops you from worrying about it.
And I think, teachers, we put ourselves into that all the time. Every single day we're stepping into something that could go wrong, aren't we? And for young teachers, new teachers, or whatever age they're coming into teaching, that's quite a big thing. And I wonder whether sometimes that's actually what holds some back in terms of being brave enough. You referred to it with your juggling. They play the safe card. What's the safe way to do this? Because I'm worried about behavior. I'm worried about progression. I'm worried about people looking at me and doing it differently. But it's taken me, I imagine I'm 50 now, and it's only really the last few years I'm the guy roller skating in the corridors and tap dancing on the tables.
Yeah.
But you want to get to that point in your 20s for some,
Well, you won't hurt yourself falling off the table.
You won't hurt yourself falling off the table, yeah.
But that's kind of where the improvisation comes in.
So we should be putting this onto teacher training courses, really, then?
Well, I would put a clowning module into a master's program.
I think it's genuinely, I knew this would be an interesting chat, but I feel what I love about doing these podcasts is I talk to people about things that I didn't think I was always going to talk about to people. And I learn things, and because I'm older now, more experienced in teaching, it really relates. I can sort of think back over my teaching career, and it really relates a lot of it.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I love talking about this, and I love that you've indulged me.
I really genuinely appreciate this, and it's been a great episode. Thanks very much, Sean. We'll speak soon.